Now, I've said to a lot of people before that I was probably very much a games-based coach. So I was using constraints in my environment, but I didn't quite understand the science behind
Yes.
constraints and ecological dynamics. And
Same.
I probably still am getting to grips with it now, even though I work for Transforming and travel the world, fortunately, to be able to deliver clinics to other coaches. I'm still getting to grips with it because it is very sciencey is the best way to
Yes,
describe it.
it is.
But the
It is.
more that you get to grips with it, the more you understand, I think the more efficient and the more creative you can become as a coach. And that's definitely the kind of relationship that I've had over the last 2 years or so with the CLA and with conceptual. I think that the easiest way for me to describe it is I changed my perception of what skill is. So
Yes.
skill isn't something that can be learned and stored and retrieved on demand to be played out. That's not the way the game works. If I was to stand up from my chair now, I wouldn't think about every movement that I take to be able to stand up. So actually, we talk about skill as how a performer interacts with the environment around them. That changed my approach then to how can I use constraints in my practice environment to present different opportunities, or in the kind of verbiage, an affordance, an opportunity for action. And the more that I understood that, the more I was able to shape a much more creative, a much more engaging, and a much more intentional practice environment. And that's kind of been my journey over the last 18 months. I'm far from being an expert right now, but the thing that I love about the CLA is I can continue to evolve as a coach the more I get to grips with it without becoming that repetitive, you said drill sergeant, where I have my book of 20 drills and this is tried and tested and this is what's always worked for me. And I'm always doing that because the players very quickly become great at those drills, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to the game.
1,000%. And I'm on a similar journey. I think I just started a little bit earlier, and I just started binging the Transforming Basketball podcast because it's like, what in the world is an affordance? Like ecological dynamics. Like, why do what? Like, I just want to coach basketball. And like sciencey. Like, I started at university to try and get human physiology and try and do that, but like I learned real quick, I didn't want to do chemistry, biology, and all of that. So then at first, when I'm looking through some of this, I'm like, oh my God, because I'm similar. I started as the games approach, I just set up small sided games, and I'm like, oh, they're just, doing games, but I didn't realize like there's so much that goes into it. Like I still have to get so much better at it. And like, it's like exciting and like scary at the same time. So I'm just curious, like, how have you continued to build on your knowledge, of course, and then how do you teach that, and can you give an example of like a practice or like an evolution of like a season, and you used a certain constraint of 0-second decisions and you built on it over here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I think the biggest thing for me with going into a practice environment and what we want that environment to look like is what's our intention and where is our attention. And that's something that Alex said to all of us as coaches at London Lions very early, is that all of our practices need to be intentional and we need to be aware of what we're guiding the players' attention to. And that's helped me to massively understand how I'm trying to create a practice and an environment and what I want that to look like. I think that the biggest challenge for me as a coach is how I make my environment as non-linear as possible, so that we're not building from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, because again, the game doesn't reflect that when they get into playing live and there's an opposition and there's 5 guys wearing a different jersey color to you. Like, it just doesn't look like that. So how can we be very intentional, but in a non-linear fashion, that we're still getting in the reps that we need without repetition? So that repetition without repetition. And so that for me is what a typical practice will look like. We will do some form of activation that typically has nothing to do with basketball. We've been known to play flag football. We've been known to play volleyball. We've played a bit of tennis. We'll do different small-sided relay games just to get the players going and moving. Then we'll get into our activation. Again, very repetition without repetition, so that they're exploring different degrees of freedom within their warm-up, and we're not just limiting them to, as they do their activation, it's the same lunge after lunge, because again, when they come to moving, when they come to navigating their environment, it doesn't look like that. And then the practice, to someone that doesn't know the CLA, probably feels like it bounces around all over the place. So we might start with a 3v2, move into a 1v1, then get to a 4v4, then to a 5, and it might look like we are throwing, like you said, a bunch of different small-sided games. And I think at first that's probably what it did look like, until I started to understand how I can manipulate the constraints in that environment to get the players to act on something. And that's where I think from a player's perspective, that's massively engaging, because it's very rare that in a practice we will do the same thing twice. It's very rare that in the space of a 2-week period we'll do the same thing twice. We might be working on the same concept or the same aspect within how we want to play, but the way that we do that, what you would typically call the drill, but for us, a small-sided game that we will use to be able to do that, is always going to change and evolve. And I think as coaches, the real art in that comes into your environment, when a lot of coaches are taught about the plan, do, review cycle. So what's my plan? I'm going to go do it. And then after the practice, I'm going to review it. What went well? What didn't go well? I think on the micro level, the CLA is doing that constantly throughout a practice, and being able to plan that in a 1 hour 30, so a 90-minute practice, we may have 6 small-sided games that we're going to look at, with 4 or 5 constraints planned in each. But if I recognize that the players aren't learning and moving towards the affordances that I planned, I might change those constraints on the fly. And so that plan, do, review cycle is constantly going on in my mind, as well as watching what the players are doing in front of me. And I think that's where that intention and attention comes back to the fore. So as well as the players, where's my attention as a coach, and what did I want the intention of this small-sided game to be, to get to the end goal, which ultimately is, we want them to be more skillful in that environment. We want them to be able to act upon the affordances that present themselves.
100%. And I feel like that's been my biggest growth these last 3 to 4 months is the constraints, and then giving individual constraints, like whether it's a training session or a team practice, like, hey, my point guard, he has 5 dribbles, but everyone else, y'all got 2. So it's catch a rip or move on. And so those are some of the things like I'm still working at and trying to get better at. So can you kind of give a context of like, what are some of the different constraints that you give your team? And then what are the certain constraints you give to certain individual athletes?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to think about it is there's 3 areas that we could constrain. So we can constrain the environment, the task, or the performer. So when you understand that and how that shapes the environment that you're trying to create, that helps to get to the end goal again, which is those affordances that we want to present themselves. So we could add in time constraints. We could constrain the space that's available to athletes. For something like the pick and roll, for example, when I'm installing pick and roll and the different coverage solutions that we want the players to become attuned to, we may start out 2v1, but we'll constrain the space that's available to them. Then we might build it out over time to a 2v2 and a 3v3, still constraining the space. So a great one that I love to go with on the environment piece is what we call wall pick and roll. So let's say we're running a side pick and roll on the 45, the opposite lane line is out of bounds now. And we'll just have a coach stand there with their arms out, or maybe stick a couple of cones down, and anything that goes past that space is out of bounds. Because in the game, that's your roll tag, and that's your gap defender. And so actually we want you to become efficient in punishing whatever coverage it is that we see with our coverage solution, and becoming highly attuned to the different affordances there that might present themselves. So we could do that. You mentioned a couple of great ones around on the performer side. Maybe I could add individual constraints to players in practice. So actually you only get 5 dribble 4. You have to hit ahead within 3 seconds of you receiving the ball if we want to push faster in transition. You could strip it even further back, and I know you have some listeners of the podcast that teach the even younger age groups. that actually when you're first teaching someone to do a layup, we still wouldn't teach it 1v0. We'd teach it 1v1, but we would constrain the defender that you can only stand in the smile and you can't move. You can only have your hands above your head.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Already there's an external cue so that that player that's never done a layup before isn't being taught right, left, extend, 90 degree between your elbow and your knee. Because again, in game, it doesn't look like that. And so these fundamentals do not exist. How can I make that performer skillfully able to navigate their environment? Well, I can add a defender and heavily constrain what that defender can do. And I think in a practice, we would see, and we're obviously talking about at the very entry level what that would look like, but in a practice, the real art in it is understanding what do my individual players need on a day-to-day basis to get to the point that we want to get them to.